Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I hope you can sit comfortably, find yourself something, a cozy place to sit. We've got a beautiful night ahead of us and fascinating content. It is crucial at this time to have discussions like this, faced with so many challenges on the planet. This is important. So thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome George Monbiot.
Thank you, Lulu. Thank you. Now, like a lot of people with a plant-based diet, I often get quizzed about it. And some people object to that and say, well, why should it be me who's being quizzed? But I don't mind, because every conversation is an opportunity for persuasion. So I explain that I've got a plant-based diet because meat and other animal products are really expensive environmentally. They use a great deal of land, far more land than a plant-based diet does, produce far more pollution, far more greenhouse gases because of the amount of grain and pulses and other crops that animals have to eat in order to produce that meat or that milk or the eggs. They also require a lot more feed, which means much more pesticides, much more fertilizer, much more soil erosion, all the rest of it. And having done this, on a few occasions, I've had what I consider a really weird response, which is along the lines of, oh, so not for moral reasons then? I'm like, how are those not moral reasons? How is the destruction of the living planet not a moral issue? How is intergenerational justice, like what we pass on to the next generations, not a moral issue? How is the massive loss of habitats, of wildlife? How is pollution? How is climate breakdown? How are these not moral issues? And of course, what they meant was not for animal welfare purposes. Well, yes, also for animal welfare purposes, but my primary purposes are environmental. But what we see here, I think, is a clash between 20th century morality and what I see as a 21st century morality. That 20th century morality could be described as your immediate and visible impacts upon another immediately visible being. So something good or bad that you might do to your neighbor or to your friend or to your partner, or to someone else who could clearly be identified. If you mug someone in the street, clearly you were doing something morally wrong to that person. But as we have begun to understand to a greater extent the scope of our impacts upon other people and other places, often right on the other side of the planet, we've discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, a new ethics, an ethics which demands a much wider worldview. And I say rediscovered because towards the end of the 18th century, there was a very similar enlightenment, if you like, which was the discovery of the impacts of the sugar trade. And while there were many, many forces at play around that sugar trade, which in other words means the slave trade, there were considerable numbers of people in England who just stopped eating sugar. They boycotted it because they recognized the moral impact which those purchases had, that leverage had, how those purchases were soaked in blood. But to reach that point, it took a huge effort of moral suasion on the part of slaves and former slaves themselves, and the slave revolts are absolutely crucial in this, on the part of non-slaves, advocating on the part of slaves, to begin to shift that moral compass so that people could see, and it takes this leap of imagination, that their impact was not confined to something bad they might do to someone they knew, but simply by buying this, well, it was then a brown lump, today it would be white crystals, you're having an impact on someone else a very long way away. And environmentalism is a rediscovery of that wider moral compass, which has, frankly, it's always been there, or for a very, very long time. We've exerted long distance impacts, these moral teleconnections, if you like, from one part of the world to another, things that might seem, in the immediate sense, entirely innocent. Turning on your kettle to make a cup of tea, going to the shops to buy your dinner, suddenly, when seen from the planetary perspective, take on an entirely different hue. And what we've seen across the ages are attempts to try to pass those moral questions and to reduce them to small questions that we can cope with. So in other words, buying sugar was wrong. Yeah, a lot of people began to see towards the end of the 18th century, consumers of sugar here in England and indeed in Scotland, that buying sugar was a bad thing to do. But somehow they managed to detach that from all the issues that appropriately, stickily surrounded that issue of sugar. And a classic example you find in Jane Eyre, where Mr. Rochester's investments and the source of his wealth was tainted. It came from the Caribbean. In other words, it came from slavery. But towards the end of the novel, Jane Eyre acquires money which is in English investments. And the implication very strongly is that those are okay. Those aren't extracted from the blood of slaves in the Caribbean. These are good, honest, God-fearing English investments made in England. But of course, you couldn't separate that money. In fact, it was arguable then, and it's still arguable today, that English wealth arose from its exploitation of other parts of the world, particularly of the Caribbean. And there was no part of the English economy which was untouched by the blood money that came from the Caribbean, or from the Atlantic slave trade, which of course was intimately associated with it, or from the exploitation of India, from which, according to one estimate, the equivalent in modern terms of $45 trillion was extracted by England for its own enrichment. And of course, that money was then used to finance the imperial wars and the capture of other lands and the exploitation of those lands and the seizure of their wealth. And you could see that wealth accumulating and accumulating and accumulating, and was absolutely at the basis of the English Industrial Revolution and of all the enrichment which followed from that. And in fact, the reason that the cotton mills were so financially successful in England was that the English had effectively shut down the cotton mills in India and forced the trade to move to England, where we could capture the riches here. And so Charlotte Bronte's belief that Caribbean investments were bad because they were blood-soaked, and English investments were good because they were the sort of ethical bank equivalent of that we would have today in the 21st century, you just could not sustain that belief when you began to unpick it. And the same applies to our sources of wealth today. There is no money that is untainted by what could be described as a modern form of imperialism, where we use coercive trade agreements, international debt as a lever, transfer pricing so that corporations don't pay tax in the country from which they extract resources, horrendously exploitative labor relations, to basically shift wealth from poor countries into rich ones. And poor countries in terms of the amount of ready cash they have, but countries which are extremely rich in natural resources, which we find a way of capturing for far less than the monetary value that we extract from them. And particularly in the United Kingdom, where the City of London functions as a sort of entrepot for dirty money around the whole world. It is the world's money laundering capital, and even some of its most esteemed organizations are up to their necks in it. A US investigation into HSBC found it was absolutely swimming in drug money, in weapons money, and all sorts of nefarious sources of wealth, which were channeled through its branches, no questions asked. And that is basically what the City of London does. And people say, oh, look at those terribly corrupt countries where these leaders are just diverting all the money into their own pockets, the foreign aid money, the foreign direct investment money, the taxes, they steal that money. Aren't they corrupt? Well, where does that money go? How do they clean that money? They clean it through the City of London. And because the City of London is the wealth generator, supposed wealth creator, we're all tainted by that, because so much of the money that passes through this country passes through it by that means, and everything else we do is related to that source of wealth. So, but even that is not the full story today, because it's also the case that no money is without environmental implications. Joseph Stiglitz, who's a guy I greatly admire, he used to be chief economist at the World Bank. He's a Nobel economics laureate. He's written some fantastic books. But in his latest book, he argues that you can make a distinction between wealth creation and wealth extraction. You can say you've got your entrepreneurs who create wealth by their brilliance and their perspicacity and their hard work, and they generate wealth where wealth wouldn't have been there before. And then you've got your parasites, your rentiers who extract the wealth which other people create. And within the standard framework of understanding of capitalism, yeah, you can make that distinction. But if all our wealth is a result ultimately of extraction, not just from other countries, but also from future generations, then that distinction breaks down very quickly. That your brilliant motor entrepreneur who creates a new car and generates wealth, is a wealth creator, is actually extracting wealth in terms of the resources that car needs to be built and in terms of the fuel that car is going to burn. And it's the same with almost every form of what we call wealth creation, that it has severe environmental implications. And so we can congratulate ourselves on being the right side of that divide. But when you stand back far enough from it, you see that capitalism is really a pyramid scheme, that its apparent health today depends on unpayable debts incurred in the future. And those primarily are environmental debts. So just like Jane Eyre's money, that money which we claim to create today is money which has actually been extracted from somewhere or some time else. Now, there's a belief that we can consume our way out of trouble. We can be good consumers. We can be green consumers. And of course, yeah, we should try to consume better stuff rather than worse stuff, which is why I follow a plant-based diet. But to be honest, apart from dietary issues, which really make a big impact, and transport issues, almost everything else we do in terms of what we do or don't consume makes scarcely any difference. And people become obsessed by plastic bags, for instance, and plastic bags are a total menace. Yeah, there are far too many plastic bags. And so the response, including from organizations that I'm not a million miles from, is to say, we need a better kind of plastic bag. We need to make plastic bags instead from, say, potato starch. And of course that's good, isn't it? Because potatoes, they're not fossil fuels. And they're growing, they're green, they grow underneath green plants, and they use photosynthesis to create their sugars and to create the starch, which we then turn into plastic bags. But potatoes turn out to need a lot of fossil fuel to grow. They also turn out to be very hungry for pesticides and fertilizers, and very thirsty for water, and highly associated with soil erosion, because they're rowed up. The soil is rowed up when the potatoes are growing, and that makes it very friable and susceptible to being washed off the land. And if you were to add up all those impacts, and unfortunately no one has yet done it, you would almost certainly discover that plastic bags made from potato starch were worse than plastic bags made from fossil fuels in terms of all of their impacts. The whole way from carbon emissions, because soil erosion is heavily implicated in carbon emissions, let alone all the other forms of fossil fuel which are associated with growing potatoes, to habitat destruction, to wildlife destruction, all the rest of it, even worse than fossil fuels, as indeed so many biological substitutes are. You know, biodiesel made from palm oil, ethanol made from maize, generally in at least one respect, and often in several, they're worse than fossil fuels. And actually plastic bags made out of potatoes are about the worst there is. And so, of course, the answer is no plastic bag. Let's not have the one made out of fossil fuel, and let's not have the one made out of potatoes either. But that's not an answer that can be accepted in mainstream discourse, because it's not an answer that capitalism can accept. The answer has always got to be buy something else, as opposed to don't buy something. And to this end, huge effort is poured into marketing and advertising to persuade us that to go green, we need to be green consumers. And we need just to choose this slightly differentiated product within broadly the same marketplace, and suddenly we'll go from being bad people to virtuous people. Because that's the only politically acceptable alternative to the way we currently live within the mainstream media and within, of course, commercial discourse, because the one thing they can't sell us is nothing. Well, they do try, but you know, we're not going to pay for it. So you say to yourself, well, you know, there's surely got to be a way. I mean, I've got to be able to find a way of living, of maintaining my quality of life while imposing a smaller impact on the living world. And there isn't. And there isn't if you're going to maintain the level of wealth you currently have, because there's a kink in the human brain, which basically means that we convince ourselves we're doing fine when we aren't. We home in on the things we do well and persuade ourselves that that represents our moral character, and we ignore the things we do badly. So a friend of mine, for instance, came across this fantastic story in a local newspaper where these people had been collecting supermarket tokens which they were getting for recycling, and they were assiduous recyclers. And they spent years and years doing their recycling and collecting these tokens, and what they used the tokens for was a holiday to the Caribbean. And it's just like, well, we've done the recycling. What's the issue? And of course, by flying to the Caribbean, you undo anything you've done in terms of recycling 100-fold, probably 1,000-fold, not least because a lot of that recycling actually doesn't even go to recycling, as we've begun to discover. Not that it's a bad thing to do, but it's not going to solve our problems. And there's a wide range of academic literature showing that it doesn't really matter what you think you are, whether you think you're a good consumer or a bad consumer, your impact is going pretty well to match your level of wealth. If you're a rich person, you will consume far more than if you're a poor person. It's as simple as that. The only difference is a slight difference in diet, that supposedly green consumers who are rich tend to have a slightly lower impact diet than people of equal wealth who don't see themselves as green consumers. But on no other metric is there any discernible difference. There's no difference in transport patterns, there's no difference in housing, there's no difference in energy consumption, There might be slightly different sources of energy consumption, but while there's not enough green energy at the moment, that's fairly marginal in its impacts. It might make some difference, but not a huge amount. Broadly, the impacts are the same, that you just consume up to that point that your wealth allows. Now, perhaps the most devastating form of consumption is housing. And what tends to happen here in the UK and indeed in many other countries is that when you reach a certain level of wealth, you acquire more than one home. You buy yourself a second home. Some people then go on to buy themselves third or fourth or fifth homes. Now, in my view, this is profoundly unethical on all sorts of levels. We've got a massive housing shortage. We've got many homeless people. We've got many underhoused people. It's also a complete environmental catastrophe. Because if you're occupying two homes, then someone who would otherwise have lived in one of those homes has to have a house built for them, a whole other house built. All that steel, all that timber, all those bricks, all that plaster, all that stone, all the materials that go into a house, plus all the stuff in the house, all the washing machine and the dishwasher and the bath and the shower and the beds and all the other things required to live in a house, that all gets doubled if you own two houses and tripled if you own three houses. But this is what wealthy people do. They buy extra houses because, that's not bad, is it? I'm not buying a private jet. Just another house. And that's how the moral slippage happens, until you get these extraordinary situations where you'll get some celebrity event to discuss the state of the planet and what we need to do about it, and they will all arrive in private jets to discuss this, and then drive around the private island in their supercars and stay in this 5-star hotel, and then they'll probably all decide that, yes, the real environmental problem is population. It's those people breeding too much. That's generally what comes out of these meetings. Because otherwise they would have to look at themselves and say, maybe it's these people consuming too much. And consumerism is not just something that happens as a byproduct of capitalism. Of course, it's absolutely fundamental to capitalism. You can't have continued economic growth unless people with disposable wealth can be induced to part with that wealth. By definition, people who don't have disposable wealth will not spend any more than they spend already. But people who do, you've got to find a way of getting them to spend that money. That's what your growth as a particular company or an entrepreneur depends on, and that's what the growth of the economy as a whole depends on, is getting those people with disposable cash to spend it. And they do. Mind you, even if they invest it, it tends to have very similar impacts also, because most forms of investment are absolutely devastating and help to fuel the machine in different but allied ways. And so there's a whole infrastructure of persuasion, making use of the best psychologists and the best neuroscientists to persuade you to part with that money for a more and more fancy car, a more and more fancy wristwatch, a more and more fancy home, a bigger and bigger swimming pool. And oh my God, you've got one of those swimming pools which actually is sort of like sunken. It doesn't seem, it's not an infinity pool. What are you thinking? Get rid of it. This is the 21st century. It's never enough. There's never a point at which you can say, I'm done. I've got it. I've arrived. Because there's always someone telling you, well, someone else has got something better than you've got. Something more stylish, something more fashionable, something more desirable than the thing you've got. And if you've got that money, the temptation to put, it's not even a temptation, it's almost a sort of, it feels like a sort of moral duty almost to part with it. Otherwise, you're a sort of class traitor. You're a traitor to people in your economic bracket if you're not spending that money. But consumerism does more than that. It's not just a form of persuasion. It is also the stifling of the moral imagination. And I don't just mean by that consumerism arises from the stifling of the moral imagination or causes the stifling of the moral imagination, because it does both of those things, but it also is the stifling of the moral imagination. Now, Michael Sandel, in his book, What Money Can't Buy, talks about how extrinsic values, in other words, wealth, fame, status, displace intrinsic values. They don't sit happily alongside each other. If you put a lot of your energy and desire and value into money and fame and status and stuff, you will put less into community and love and kindness to others. And there's a huge range of research showing that people with a lot of money tend to have less empathy than people who've got much less money. And there's one interesting study showing that the smarter the car is, the less likely it is to stop at a pedestrian crossing. There's another one showing that people with a lot of money found it harder to care about children with cancer. There's lots of quite clever psychological experiments where you can measure these things and show that something goes horribly wrong. It's almost like you get a certain degree of wealth and it's like a bit of your brain has been removed. Like you've had a brain injury caused by that money, because you can't connect, you can't relate in the same way anymore. Whether it's because you get arrogant, whether it's because life is too easy and you can't understand why it's not easy for everybody else, and why can't they just buy that thing they need? You know, why are they eating rubbish food when they could buy good food? You know, it stifles your imagination. It makes it hard to see it. Quite what's happening, it's hard to know, but there's a very marked and distinct effect from having wealth. And look at what the aspiration of wealth is. It's to remove yourself from society. Look at the houses that people buy for themselves when they become extremely rich. They've got long drives with electric gates at the top of the drive to keep everyone out, and high walls and security cameras and maybe dogs roaming the grounds to make sure they have no unexpected encounters. No contact with anyone that hasn't already been arranged, probably with anyone they haven't paid to have some contact with them in some sort of service position, or an invited guest. But they basically remove themselves from society and remove themselves to a very large extent from civic life. You no longer send your children to the state school, you'll send them to a private school. You're not going to use public transport. You'll have your chauffeur-driven car. You wouldn't even use a public aeroplane. You'll use private jet, and certainly not the public health system. Heaven forfend. You'll get your top private health, and it's that detachment from civic life, detachment from society, which is supposed to be desirable. This is what we're told to aspire to. It's all the fairy tale endings, is when you end up having been poor with a pile of wealth, whereupon you can kiss goodbye to society. To me, that sounds like a nightmare. What a horrendous, it's just like, what an awful life to lead. And from time to time, I meet very rich people, and some of them are very charming and very lovely, but there's always that sort of just slight edge of suspicion, of wariness, and what is this person going to take from me? There's some slight paranoia that, heavy as a head that wears the crown. They're gonna take this thing which distinguishes me from them, which elevates me above them. This thing is fragile. This thing is susceptible. And that's why very rich people put so much effort into political lobbying and pour money into right-wing political parties to basically ensure that their money is not eroded by taxes or by redistribution of any kind, that they're going to cling on to that money. And the combination, I think, of that moral stifling and the fact that your level of wealth pretty well determines your level of environmental impact means that even if it's not true, as Balzac probably didn't say, but was reputed to have said, that behind every great fortune lies a great crime, because we know there's some fortunes which didn't arise from crime, a few, not very many, but J.K. Rowling's fortune, for example, or a great musician's fortune. You know, they actually were performing a good service to society, doing something good. Behind their fortune did not lie a great crime, but in front of every fortune lies a great crime. Because that fortune will almost inevitably it will inexorably be used to destroy the living world. Because we cannot accommodate everyone's private luxury. There's simply not enough planetary space to make that possible. If someone has one huge home, then a second home, then a third home, a massive chauffeur-driven car, maybe a private jet, maybe a private island, maybe a giant yacht to get to that island, you only need a few tens of thousands of those people and you've cooked the whole planet. I was contacted once by a man who was working at an airport where private jets were taking off. And he said, I'm seeing things which nobody should see. He said, some of these private jets are 737s designed to take 174 passengers, but there's a single person being flown on them. It's all been emptied out into some massive internal space. He said, we fill them up with 32,000 liters of fuel. That's what the jet takes. And so this person who's being flown to another continent with this whole jetliner just set aside from that person is probably using as much fuel on that journey as a small African town uses in a year. So when Jane Goodall turns up at the World Economic Forum and says the world would be just fine if we had the same population as we had 500 years ago, which was roughly 500 million people, say, well, not if the people you're talking to are that population, because at the World Economic Forum, you've got some of the richest people on earth sitting there. You wouldn't need 500 million of them to cook the planet. You wouldn't even need 5 million of them. That's all it would take. It would be less than 5 million people, and that living at their level of extravagance, that would destroy everything. Didn't help that soon before that, she appeared on an advert for British Airways. It's like, no. Anyway, sorry, I don't mean to have a go, but it just was so distressing and upsetting. It was almost the worst thing I saw that year, and there was quite a lot. Anyway, sorry, a bit of a diversion. I mean, I don't mean to have a go, but it does really piss me off when this sort of it's that moral distraction of diverting the impacts that the very rich are causing onto the very poor, who are the people whose populations are growing. And yeah, let's talk about this for a moment because it is important. Yeah, population has an impact. There's no question. You know, the more people there are on Earth, the greater impact there will be. But because population growth takes place almost entirely amongst the world's poorest people, that's where the highest population growth rates are, and because the total impact of population is, or the total impact rather, is population times affluence times technology, if the people whose numbers are rising are those with almost no affluence and almost no technology, their environmental impact is actually going to be very small. And as it happens, population growth seems to be remarkably grinding to a halt. It's becoming very close. It's now fallen to just 1%. It's pretty well halved in just a few decades. And some people are now talking about peaking sort of 2060, 2070, and then declining. Of course, consumption shows no such trend. That's just rising and rising. And yeah, as I say, there are impacts, but there's also, it's obviously highly tempting for a lot of people to just use population as a way of pointing the finger to someone else and saying, it's not me, it's not my fault, it's not all this consumption I'm doing, it's those people breeding. That's where the problem lies. And so how do you distinguish between someone with a genuine concern about population growth and someone who's just using it to distract attention from their own impacts, even if it's subconsciously? Well, in my view, it's pretty clear, because The reason why population growth rates decline is that women have better opportunities. Education, better employment, other ways of achieving social status, their place in society, than just having lots of children. And that is intimately connected with the distribution of wealth. In very poor places, women have very few opportunities. So if you want to know whether someone is genuine about their concern for population, look at their record. Have they campaigned about the extractive economy, which rips money out of poorer nations through leveraging, through debt, through trade agreements, through exploitation of labor, through transfer pricing, through corporations not paying their taxes in the country of origin or anywhere, tax havens? Have they campaigned about that stuff? Have they raised a stink about it? And if the answer is no, well, that's a pretty clear indication that they couldn't give a tinker's cuss about population except as a means of pointing the finger away from themselves, which I'm afraid happens again and again. And in fact, there is a population crisis. There's a genuine population crisis, but it's not the human population which is the problem, it's the livestock population. Because while the human population is rising at roughly 1.05% per year, the livestock population is rising at 2.4% a year. At current rates of growth by 2050, to put it in brutal terms, there'll be just over 100 million tons more human beings on Earth and 400 million tons more livestock on Earth. And those livestock will be fed on grain, will be fed on pulses, will be fed on stuff which is currently feeding human beings, or that there will be a massive expansion of agricultural land area into forests, into nature reserves, into the places put aside for nature in order to feed that livestock. That's a real population crisis. And that's why consuming less meat is one thing we genuinely can do. Stop consuming altogether, even better. But apart from that, as I say, the problem is wealth. And so the answer, well, the answer is 21st century blasphemy. It's a form of heresy. It's saying we should stop aspiring constantly to get richer. We should recognize this totally weird alien concept of enough. We should be able to say to ourselves, actually, this is enough. I don't want more of that, because if I have more of that, I will have less of this. I will have less humanity. I will have less contact with other people. I will have less community, less society, less love, less empathy if I have more money. I will have a narrower conscience. I will have a smaller morality if I have more money, because of the harm that will do. And in political terms, well, that translates into something even more heretical. That just as there should be a poverty line below which no one should fall, there should be a wealth line above which no one should rise. This is a concept formulated by the Belgian philosopher Ingrid Robbins, who calls it limitarianism. Let's not allow any of us to get too rich. Let's ensure that money is distributed so that everybody has a fair share. And let's have completely different values, different fairy tale endings for the sort of world that we want to aspire to, the sort of lives that we want to lead. And for me, that fairy tale ending is something I call public luxury, private sufficiency. Because while there's not enough ecological space or even enough physical space for us all to enjoy private luxury, which is the ultimate promise of capitalism, you will be the next Bill Gates, you will have loads of homes, you will have your own tennis court and your own swimming pool and your own limousine and your own private jet and your own private island and your own private yacht to get there. I mean, there's literally not enough physical space, there's not enough land for everyone to have that, let alone the enormous ecological impacts. What if instead we said, we will all have lovely places to live and to play and to entertain ourselves, and we will have public tennis courts and public swimming pools and public libraries and public art galleries and public places which are luxurious. And the great thing about putting that effort of luxury into the public sphere, the civic sphere, is that you actually create space by doing so. When you expand private luxury, you take space from other people, either literal physical space or ecological space from others. But when you expand public luxury, when you have a great municipal life, then what that does is to create more room for everybody. And yeah, private sufficiency. I'm not saying, we turn everything over to the public sphere or even to the commons. So the commons, shared resources, should be a much bigger part of our lives, I feel, than it is at the moment. But, we have our own homes, our own private sufficiency, and they're good. They're fine. They're enough. Enough. We have enough. But then the wealth of society is expressed in the public sphere, is expressed in those great parks, those great sporting facilities, those great cultural institutions, which will be free for everybody, where everyone can participate in that life of public luxury as equals. Private sufficiency, public luxury. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So good. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm just thinking, you don't see any animals in nature just going, it's mine. I've just got this stash.
Yeah.
Do you?
Well, no, I mean, of course, animals do store things, but not beyond the point of their own need for that particular resource. So, for instance, a jay, the European jay, an amazing bird. It's one of the most fascinating birds of all, greatly undervalued. Will bury between 4,000 and 5,000 acorns a year, all in different places. It doesn't bury one stash like a squirrel does, everywhere in different places. It'll remember where every single one of those acorns is, and those will be enough acorns to get it through the winter. That's what it'll survive on during the winter, And basically, the jay is what plants the oak trees, either because they don't get through all their acorns, or because that jay might die during the course of the winter, and in which case all those are planted acorns, which is just scattered around the countryside. And so nothing has been taken away. And of course, because the jay exists within the ecosystem, all the nutrients are recycled. And it's helping to sustain that wider system that everything else is a part of. So while it's ostensibly taking stuff and storing it, it's also giving that stuff at the same time. And that's basically how the commons works. That so a classic example might be your allotments, for example, and I've share with some other families 3 allotment plots which we put together to turn into an orchard. We've got like sort of 40 heritage fruit trees growing across those 3 plots, and there's 5 families. But we're part of this allotment association, which has got 200 odd plots or so and of course we're not taking that land. We're just using it for whatever period we're going to be in the town, and then when we move on, somebody else who's on the waiting list gets that land, and we manage that land as a commons together. There's no ownership, or the ownership is not vested in us, but we're charged with maintaining it in good condition, not eroding the soil, not pouring nasty chemicals on it, making sure that when we hand it over to the next person, it's going to be in as good condition as before. And we manage it to enhance the wealth of everyone within the association. And when I say wealth, I don't mean financial wealth, but the wealth of experience, the wealth of being. Yeah, the
sharing of skills.
Absolutely. And there's people from origins from all over the world on that allotment site, and we share those skills, we share those experiences, and we enrich each other without any money ever changing hands.
Absolutely. And then you've also spoken in the past of the commons moving up and up into different levels, haven't you? Like better Reykjavik,
yes.
You know, towns, social organisms, just making decisions for themselves.
Yeah.
And again, in urban planning, you know, this whole thing where you don't ask town planners to plan it, you ask the children and the mothers, and and you get nature around you, and you get the places that are healthy and breed those things.
We should live like jays, you know, just put aside only what we need and let it go back into society, back into the ecosystem.
Yeah. I think animals can teach us so much. They don't have any baggage, no material stuff, do they?
No. we have greater needs, of course. You know, I mean, we would die of exposure pretty quickly, but you know, within the circular economy, we can supply those needs. You know, with far lower environmental impacts, but also within that broader conception of enough, which is the exact opposite of consumerism. Satiety.
Enough. Yeah. It's interesting as well. It's getting the head out of not having these things as some sort of austerity, and actually it's engaging with life's abundance of what really is important.
And there is enough. I mean, they're really, you know, it's still true today what Gandhi said, you know, there's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And that is still the case, even though there's a lot more people. In fact, there's a fascinating paper published in Science of the Total Environment about Ethiopia. So it looks at northern Ethiopia, Tigray, and one or two surrounding parts. Across the period from 1868 to the present day. And during that time, the population of Ethiopia, wait for it, has risen from 7 million to 112 million. So you think, oh my God, what an environmental disaster that is. It's the exact opposite. And what so they got these photos, this incredible photo archive they found going back to 1868. And then they were able to take photos from exactly the same vantage points and analyze the landscape in those photos and then analyze the landscape in the new photos they were taking. There were more trees, there was less soil erosion, the land was more productive as well, there was more wildlife than there was before. And the reason was that the issue was not population, the issue was policy. That in 1868, it had been feudal tenure. And a few very big rich people had owned all the fertile land and basically pushed everyone else out into the fragile slopes where they took their goats and their cattle and caused a great deal of erosion, and none of the no little trees could survive because the livestock ate them all, and people were desperate, and so they were trying to exploit areas which just weren't suitable to keep people alive. Yeah. And then in the 1970s and 80s, there was massive land reform where land was pretty equally distributed, followed by quite a few regreening policies of getting trees back into the landscape, of creating bunds to prevent the soil from eroding and stuff. And the impact was extraordinary. You know, even though there were far, far more people in the landscape, it was actually far better environmental values at the same time and much less land degradation. And so it's, you know, it's one example, but it does show that it's still the case that there is enough for everyone's need, even though there are so many more people, but only if the policy is right. I mean, it's almost a sort of microcosm of the two different worlds we could live in. One which is basically wrapped up by a few feudal lords who got almost everything for themselves and everyone else is starving, and one in that you've got shared prosperity within environmental limits. Amazing.
That is aspirational.
Yeah. Shall we take a break now?
Let's have a break. So if we have a 15-minute break, we're calling in for questions still, coming in live, so that we can ask George live after the break. Enjoy 15 minutes of music, poetry and talks, very, very beautiful words and performances. So Thank you, George, and we'll see you in 15. I'm just going to give you the email address. It's events@resurgence.org. Fire them over, and I'll get them to George in 15.
If I told you what I know, you would not believe me. So I will tell you what I do not know. I do not know how bad it will get before things get better. How many more we will lose to drought and flood, fire and famine, to mass incarceration, mass extinction, to hate crime and domestic violence, to the police, to the TV and toxic food. How many more we will lose to pollution of our waterways and airwaves and bloodstreams, our livers and rivers and oceans and imaginations. How many to the war on terror and drugs and Crips and Bloods and thugs and babies and gays and immigrants and indigenous people and differently abled and madly genius and schizophrenically gifted, and the war on thinking and the war on love. How many we will lose to the lust for enough money to bribe God to turn the other way. If I told you what I know, love is stronger than hate, and truth is more enduring than any lie that lies can take. If you are not willing to change, I know nothing will change. Life is teetering on the precipice of our willingness to let go of what is killing us and the earth's forgiveness for what we have spoiled. Regeneration is the natural order of existence. Destiny will give birth to itself, re-spiraling the cycle of the universe's just rising. With each breath, will we be there to exhale?
We have come to equate consumption with well-being. So we commonly understand that the more we consume, the better off we are. But this was not always so. This link that we now consider an obvious thing is actually the product of centuries of colonialism, extraction, and dispossession. And it's actually the other side of the coin of a project of progress and civilization that is based on increasing productivity and increasing the stuff that we buy and we sell to each other. Question this link. Let's do this by using the example of food. For instance, in many places in the global south, now people earn and spend more money in food than they did before. So in the numbers, they might seem to be increasing their well-being. But actually, in many places, this access to wage labor come at the expenses of losing community-owned land or losing traditional cultivation of local crops that were actually rich in biodiversity and food security. So in the numbers, it might seem that we're improving, but we're actually eroding that traditional capacity of giving well-being and taking care of all the communities. Questioning this assumption that more consumption is always good is fundamental when we talk about the ecological imperative, the ecological necessity of reducing our consumption or of consuming less. This call that we often do from a degrowth perspective is not a call to sacrifice or to live in a more or living a life under austerity. It's the opposite. It's an invitation to rethink life under the premise of radical abundance, of sharing, of a life outside commodified markets, of a life on community in which we take care of each other and no one goes without food or without what they need to survive just because they don't have the money. So whenever we rethink consumption, we need to take all these elements into account. Our current obsession with consumption as the only measure of well-being does not work in favor of global marginalized and dispossessed communities. On the opposite, it only benefits those who are rich and get richer by buying and selling stuff, by privatizing increasingly more spheres of our everyday lives. So more than focusing on moralizing consumption or consumerism, we need to look at the systemic features that have ingrained these machines of endless economic growth in our global economies. If we don't do that, there is no single individual choice that can change our economic system in the scale that we need to face our ecological crisis. And we need to always remember that the huge amount of stuff that now we have available in our shops for our consumption is not something natural or neutral. It's the result of global plunder, a plunder that comes from centuries-long colonial projects that continue reproducing and being legitimated by our economies today. So addressing these political inequalities must be at the heart of any project that wants to address the ecological crisis, because they are one and the same crisis. The challenge of transforming consumption will look very different depending on where you're standing. The divide between global north and global south is very important, but we must also remember that there are many norths in the south and many souths in the north. Nothing is clear-cut. The only thing that is certain is that the global ecological movement must have global justice and global solidarity as a core value in all its struggles.
How did you get into this?
How did I get into this? In November of 2004, I've been an activist in many different causes all my life. And my partner, Nancy, convinced me that climate change was really important. And I started going to climate change meetings. And I started reading articles and books and listening to lectures. And about 6 months into this, I understood what she'd been saying. And I know I did because I started to have the same dream over and over again at night, that I was screaming and screaming and screaming about something and no one could hear what I was saying. And I woke up middle of one night and I knew that's climate change. I've got to make people hear. And I thought, what can I do? What can I contribute? And I thought, the anti-capitalist movement I've been part of is doing nothing about climate change. And the trade union movement I've given my life to is doing nothing about climate change. And I could explain climate change to those people so they understand, because those people are crucial to helping to solve this problem. So I started working with unions in Britain and lots of other countries and getting together teams of climate scientists and engineers and architects and economists who together could write reports to explain to trade union members what was going on and what we could do. And we had the idea together that the solution to the problem of climate change is jobs. The governments need to hire enormous numbers of workers to do the work that needs to be done so that we can have a low carbon economy so the planet doesn't go to hell. That was the new idea we had.
What's the key takeaway the reader should take from your book?
We can avoid climate hell if governments act now, and they need to launch Green New Deals and hire people to do climate jobs. 1 million climate jobs in Britain, 8 million climate jobs in the United States, proportional elsewhere. Climate jobs are jobs creating renewable energy, jobs in public transport, jobs insulating all the houses in the world, and thousands of other jobs as well, all of them reducing the greenhouse gas emissions that go into the air. Governments can do this. When governments need the money, they find the money. If we were going into a big war, governments would hire all the soldiers they need immediately. We're going into something worse than a war. And we need them to hire all the workers immediately. And we have the workers who need jobs.
Why did you write this book now?
I wrote this book now because I saw the school student climate strikes. and they gave me hope. These people under 18 are more radical all over the world than all the older generations. This is the people who can change the world entering onto the stage of history. So I wrote like my hair was on fire, because what I want to do is to take everything I've learned in my long life that might be of use to these people and offer it to them in words they can understand. And I hope that some of them can use it to save all the living things on this planet.
The Resurgence Trust is an educational charity for ecological regeneration, social justice, and ethical living. For over 50 years, Resurgence has recognized the interconnectedness of the most pressing issues of our time and served as a leading voice at the forefront of a movement for change. This charity publishes Resurgence and Ecologist, a trailblazing magazine that takes readers on an enriching journey, exploring the environment, social justice, activism, regenerative living, and the arts. Connecting a global community of changemakers, authors, and artists, this inspiring magazine is an essential resource for those that believe a better world is possible. The Resurgence Trust also publishes The Ecologist, a free online environmental news service that has played a leading role in diagnosing the environmental crises that have become all too apparent today. Resurgence Events holds regular talks, courses, and workshops, sharing ideas and skills that have the power to create change. Bringing together international and local audiences with world-renowned speakers, these events serve to help everyone connect with themselves, with each other, and with the living earth. Some of these events are held at the Resurgence Centre, a place that nurtures community and culture in the heart of Heartland, North Devon, within an area of outstanding natural beauty. The Resurgence Trust transforms worldviews through the work of its founder, Satish Kumar, peace pilgrim, former monk, and lifelong activist. Satish is an internationally sought-after speaker, teacher, and author who has been inspiring worldwide change for over 50 years. Become a member of the Resurgence Trust to receive bi-monthly copies of Resurgence and Ecologist magazine, to enjoy a broad range of membership benefits, and to support Resurgence in contributing to a future in which humanity can live in harmony with itself and with nature.
As the ocean runs, tears in our children's arms, we know we're but living. We've danced our dance with those devil minds. Let's stand as one, use our voice, and start saving lives by holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers. brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. The stakes are high, we've been before. Our world's on its knees, bleeding out from every pore. The call to save the land, the trees, the rivers, the oceans, and as many species. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. And ooh, be the change, be the change. And be the change, be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the change, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the change, let's be the change.
Welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those beautiful performances of music, poetry, and talks. Be the Change by Tallulah Rendall. Very inspiring, very apt. So get comfortable and we'll move into a live Q&A with George and get yourself in a cozy space as we go into this next round. We have had tons of questions, so thank you. Absolutely loads. And I'm going to try and quick fire them with George as fast as I can. Questions are closed now, so please don't send any more in. We're just going to try and deal with what we've got. Ready for the first question? Okay. How do you explain the fact that so many people in the driving seat, be it corporate leaders or political leaders, seem impervious to the fact that we are destroying our life support systems, the systems on which their wealth and power ultimately depend?
Well, broadly speaking, we are a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And that's a fairly broad brush account. There are exceptions, of course, but people who are particularly attracted by wealth and power and will really ruthlessly sweep everything out of their path in order to become world king, not mentioning any names, or to achieve sort of that enormous status, very often already are very low in empathy and low in concern for people or planet. And doubtless, when you've got there, you become even lower for the reasons which we explored in the talk.
Yeah.
And so you expect to make a moral connection. You expect to be able to touch people's hearts and you say, look, you know, what's happening is terrible. You've got to act. And with almost any other human being, you would make that connection and you would touch them. But the people in those positions tend to be a very peculiar set of people. Not all of them. I don't want to say they're all. I mean, there are some exceptional people. I mean, Jacinda Ardern, for instance, who buck that general trend.
Yeah.
But for the most part, to be brutal about it, they couldn't give a shit.
Yeah. Okay.
It's entirely about just pursuing what's good for me.
Mm-hmm.
And Boris Johnson's a classic example of that, who just does not seem to care about other people, which is why we've had 120,000 dead through coronavirus
Mm-hmm.
and innumerable other disasters, because of the incredibly rapid development of inequality and other crises in this country.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a man to whose conscience you can appeal.
We can't touch
The
them.
conscience isn't there. It's not available.
Okay.
So, you can't do it. You can't do it through the moral argument. You've just got to boot these people out of office.
Brilliant. Okay. Paul Masson has argued in the article for The Ecologist that we don't have to abolish capitalism to reach zero net carbon, but that the kind of capitalism we would need to achieve zero net carbon is not acceptable to capitalists. Can we save capitalism and save the planet? And should we?
Yeah. Well, Paul Mason is a great thinker and man I greatly admire, and he's always stimulating. And he makes an interesting point there. Much of it hinges on the definition of capitalism, which is highly contested. The one I tend to use is the Karl Polanyi definition, that it's the form of market relations which involve the commodification of land, labor and money. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to see how that capitalism as defined that way could be compatible with zero carbon, let alone zero everything else or anything else. And of course, zero carbon is just one aim in terms of reducing the impacts of consumption, because it's a symptom. I mean, the incredible amount of fossil fuels we burn and the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions are a symptom of our massive profligate consumption of just about everything. And we also need to be heading towards zero waste and zero biodiversity loss and zero soil loss and zero aquifer depletion and so many other things that we should be aiming for, which are all symptoms of rising consumption. So zero rising consumption has got to be the overarching aim, and in fact a retraction of consumption, and that fundamentally is incompatible with almost any definition of capitalism. But as David Graeber famously said, the world was made by people and people can make it differently, and nothing is set in stone. None of this has to be the way it is. Things have changed out of recognition in just a few decades, often in the wrong direction. But the things which people would have said were impossible a few years before suddenly become possible, like leaving the European Union. It's just like a few years before it was just a joke. You couldn't possibly contemplate doing that seriously, and yet it happened. Anything can happen in politics. We can change this world. We can remake it.
And harking back to that altruism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing. The great majority of people, and Rutger Bregman in his Humankind book makes the point very well. The great majority of people are empathetic, well motivated, want good things to happen to other people, want to be thought of well, want to be kind, want to do good to others. But for some reason, we keep electing people to represent us who are the polar opposite of that. So we've got to just stop doing that. All right, we just stop electing tossers to be our representatives.
Right,
psychopaths.
And also something about the taking advantage of all these things through capitalism. It's this gain, it's this perma gain, isn't it? So that goes back to, can we iron out capitalism or why capitalism anyway? Why don't we just change it? Something different.
It's we would need to change it so far that it would not be recognizable as itself.
As capitalism, yeah.
And so, but this is why I feel this sort of, the way I've tried to frame it, to structure it as private sufficiency, public luxury. I think does begin to develop the sort of glimmerings of an economic framework which is completely viable. There's no reason why we can't do it on those terms, but it is fundamentally an alternative to capitalism. It is a different system to capitalism, either under the Polanyi definition or almost any other.
Great. It sort of reminds me of the ecology and economics as well. It's the bringing the earth into to this as well. So the sharing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have to live within the ecological limits, the planetary boundaries, which set what should be the limits for human activity. And so, of course, Kate Raworth describes this beautifully with her donut economics, where no one falls below the line of sufficiency, but extends beyond the planetary boundaries. And in a way, you can map Ingrid Robbins's idea of limitarianism onto that. That the planetary boundary also serves as a wealth system, as a wealth ceiling rather, the wealth ceiling beyond which we can't go collectively. And so if we can't go beyond that ceiling collectively, we can't go beyond it individually.
And it enables people to keep their jobs and things like that. It's just a different system of sharing that wealth, isn't it? And meeting your boundaries.
Something that strikes me as very interesting, incidentally, in this field is that all the top thinkers in this field are women. Nearly all that new sort of remapping of the economy along lines which are compatible with sustaining society, with living within the boundaries of the living planet. Nearly all that work has been done by women. It's quite interesting, and I think we're seeing a sort of revolution really in economics led by women.
And maybe looking at that into your voting systems. Next question. Can you describe a sustainable economic system for the world that would provide livelihoods for human beings and protect other than human life on the planet? By Anne Duncan.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty similar to the, I think we've more or less.
We've touched on that, I think, Anne. I think we've really covered that beautifully. Big business seems to be able to make products for consumers to buy, but then makes us feel like it's our fault for having made the wrong environmental choices. Apart from not buying these items, what would be the best way to influence government policy to make big business stop producing these morally unethical products? Great question.
Yeah, great question. And it strikes me, it is amazing because you're constantly, I mean, all over the world now, we've got killer clowns in charge. I mean, not all over, but in so many countries, whether it's Boris Johnson or Jair Bolsonaro or Narendra Modi or Erdogan or Orban or Duterte. I mean, there's so many of these similar kinds of people, Putin, Netanyahu, who are all sort of these, they call themselves strong men, but actually they're really weak men. They're just sort of, they've got something missing, and they have to make this great boisterous, exuberant show of themselves, and they use that as their means of gaining power. And then in all of these countries, you've got opposition parties which say, "Oh my God, what do we do? How do we confront these people?" And they keep failing to come up with a coherent vision. I mean, look at where Labour is at the moment. I mean, there's just no vision there at all at the moment. And, Corbyn, I was supportive of Corbyn with reservations, but I felt it was a bit 1970s. Bernie Sanders' vision was a bit 1970s. It just felt like sort of going back to a Keynesian model of social democracy, which actually doesn't work anymore. I mean, the fundamental problem with Keynesianism, and in fact, there's several, but in the 21st century, is that it is based on continued growth. That it's about public spending to stimulate consumer demand, which stimulates employment.
That's it.
And within a finite planet, you just can't do that.
No.
So we need a new system. And so we've got, on the one hand, a whole lot of parties desperately looking for a new vision, which could actually, around which they could build an alternative to these killer clowns. And you've got this new vision desperately looking to be adopted. Could we not perhaps bring those two things together?
Yeah. So, and this idea of actually getting them to stop making the unethical products.
Well, so, I mean,
because
you can't pick
rules
these
out
things off one.
choices.
I mean, trying to pick these things off one by one
Uh-huh.
just leads to constant retrenchment. You know, you're fighting this battle on this front and this battle on this front, and you're just surrounded by this really bad stuff which is going on. And the fundamental problem is the system, and it is you can call it capitalism enhanced by consumerism. It is a system of planetary destruction. It is a system which cannot be sustained without enormous costs to the rest of life on Earth and to human beings who are young today or have not yet been born. And if you try to pick off the parts of that system one by one, you're just always going to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what's going on. So you need people in public life with the vision and the courage to say, actually, it's not any particular product of the system which is the problem, it is the system itself. And it is this system of this thing we call wealth creation, this fairy tale where we're going to all end up with luxury, private luxury, which is literally physically impossible. I can't emphasize this enough. It cannot actually be done. So the fundamental promise of capitalism is a lie. You know, capitalism can only work when only a few people have the private luxury and are exploiting everybody else and everything else in order to maintain that private luxury. So the idea that that can spread to everyone, it could, you know, what has happened through the Industrial Revolution is it spread to a larger number of people and it's created a consumer class. But that now seems to have hit its limits. And we've seen no wage increases in countries like the UK at all for the past 10 years. And instead, we've just seen the rich becoming richer and richer and their capital assets becoming more and more valuable, housing going through the roof.
So there's growth somewhere, but not growth in other areas. And this is keeping this...
And basically, that's right. So I think that pyramid has almost met its ultimate form. And it's not going to get any wider at the top. Because it's designed not to get any wider at the top. It's designed to have a few people in charge. They don't want their position to be challenged. I mean, Bernie Ecclestone was once asked, you know, the Formula One guy was once asked, you know, why do you keep chasing more and more money? And he said, it's a way of keeping score. And that, for some very rich people, is I mean, that's probably it. Is probably right in saying that it's a way of keeping score. It's you know, I'm richer than him, but not as rich as him, so I need to But the idea is, you know, you don't want everyone to get to where you are. You really don't. And that's why you're against taxation and the distribution of wealth and things, because you want to be the one on top in this fairy tale which favors psychopaths.
We need to dissolve this
fairy tale ending for psychopaths.
Somehow this pyramid needs to dissolve, doesn't it? Into something more equal. How do we persuade, therefore, the richest in society to reduce their consumerism when it would take a major shift in the perception, in their perception of what wealth is, their scores or their trophies or...
Well, it's not a question of persuasion. I mean, it's not persuasion in the form of moral suasion. In other words, going up to someone and say, please don't be such a bastard, because actually it just does not work. Because not because necessarily people are malicious, but because we con ourselves. We're so good at this. We're just masters and mistresses of self-deception. We're really, really clever at seeing ourselves the way we want to see ourselves rather than the way that others see us. And so, you know, we will tell ourselves we are green because we keep chickens in our garden. Actually, keeping chickens in your garden is a disaster for various reasons, but I won't go into that. But, you know, sorry to all those keeping chickens. But you know, we latch on to things which make us feel, oh, I'm in touch with the earth, I'm good in this way. And actually, we completely ignore the fact that we might be having a holiday in Thailand and a second home and all those other things. And so even when people do want to do good, you know, this is what this research I mentioned during the talk shows, that, you know, people are absolutely convinced they're green consumers, but when you actually examine what they're consuming, it's no better than the person who doesn't call themselves a green consumer at the same level of wealth. And so it's the system you have to change. And that system which enables a small number of people to accumulate inordinate wealth, whereas huge numbers of people are very, very poor. Well, that's a system which we can't afford to sustain, either in terms of human welfare or in terms of the welfare of the living planet.
George. I'm reminded, do you know Martha Beck?
I've come across her work, but I don't
amazing
know.
Integrity. She's her latest book, and she talks about the kind of ideal model of humanity, where they are a pool of water and drops. Each person is a drop in the water, each person with its own ripple, but the ripples meet, and it's a flat level surface. And then she creates this power construct of where we are now, and she builds it out of sugar lumps. And she says, how does this crazy power structure become this glass pool of water where the ripples are meeting, and there's interaction, but it's level? And she got it, and she poured the water into the bottom of the sugar lump pyramid, and slowly the whole pyramid started to just dissolve. And she painted the water blue, so it went blue all the way up. And she said, you'll find it's interesting, the sugar lumps at the top are the last to notice that the entire pyramid has dissolved into a sweet pool of something completely different.
Yeah, spread the sweetness.
It's very inspiring. Okay, here's something different. Many Indigenous people refer to the values of respect, reciprocity, and reverence within the natural world, as if the beings of nature are conscious, intelligent, and communicative. This includes the principle of giving back for what you've received. How could this help to inform our relationship with commodities and the waste and pollution that we create?
It's really worth pausing and noting how weird we are. We all think we're normal, don't we? We all think we're representative of humanity, but actually people in the rich world who are relatively prosperous, who live in cities, historically, we are very, very strange. We're really anomalous, and we live very differently to the way that anybody else has ever lived before. And we've created a mores, which is very different. And in some ways, it's a good mores. We're much more into universalism than people were in the past. There's more respect for the idea of equality, even if it's not always fully implemented, but women's equality, equality between peoples, respect for sexuality, the whole range of ways in which things are better. I think parenthood is better than it was during the Industrial Revolution, at any rate. A lot of things are better, but a lot of things are really weird and not in a good way. And one of those, I think, is the commodification of the earth itself, the idea that this is just a thing which is there to serve us, and it can be broken into its component things which are there to serve us, and it has no existence in its own right. It's not an entity. I mean, it doesn't matter really if you call it conscious or breathing or living or anything, but it's just not something which deserves respect in its own right. We don't see it in that way, and that is really weird. That is a massive disjuncture from the past. It's a huge break in the chain of human being and of human consciousness. And I do think that loss of the sense of the sacred or the treasured, the valued, the respected, however we might want to put it, is a fundamental loss, not just in terms of our relationship with the world, but in terms of our own psyche.
Yeah, our internal landscape.
And somehow we need to reclaim this. It's actually as a sort of strange personal aspect, which I only became aware of this last weekend, where I went back to my childhood home for the first time in 30 odd years. And I wanted to take my family to see the common where I used to play. And of course, in those days, rural children had much more freedom than they do today, in terms of where they could go and what they could do. And we went walking around, and we went to various parts around, and I realized that I knew every square foot of that land within a 5-mile radius of my home, because from the age of, I don't know, 4 or something, I was just out roaming, and every spare moment I had, I was outdoors. I was bird watching. I was looking for chipped flints. I was exploring, climbing trees, whatever it might be, playing with my friends. And as I got older, that expanded to about a 5-mile radius. We go off on our bikes and stuff. And I realized that if you drop me blindfold into any place within that 5-mile radius, took off the blindfold, and know exactly where I was and exactly how to get home. Ever since, I've been completely hopeless at navigation. If you know, I've got a map, and I drive people mad because I can't navigate. And I realized that I could navigate perfectly on my home patch. And then it suddenly struck me that maybe the reason I can't navigate anywhere else is because that is my territory. That was my territory. And like an animal, that was the land that I knew, and I knew it so well that I could never know anywhere else again. So I don't know if that's the case, but then, and that for me sort of reinforced that sense that this isn't just a random bit of land. This isn't just the place where I happened to be brought up. This was at that time home, and that meant something. That really meant something. Yeah. And so in a way, because I was a weird kid by comparison to other people living in our urban societies, but I was probably a bit closer than the other kids to the old indigenous model of relationship with the land.
I think a lot of people in indigenous cultures are really astonished when we don't know much about our own land, our own homeland. It's like we grew up without parents or something, that we don't actually know what our hill is or our river. And they feel sad for us.
No, it is a loss. It's a real loss.
And it comes back to that, doesn't it? Of that reciprocation, that relationship. It starts there, and then it can go on and out, can't it? Let's hope that we can all build that and transform our commodity and pollution issues.
Well, I do think, I think that the loss of geographical community is a loss which we discount. Now, I don't believe there's an inherent conflict between being attached to a place and being universalist in your outlook. And in fact, there's that you can identify these two kinds of belonging, really, which is the bridging network versus the bonding network. And the bonding network is that exclusive network, is just people like me. I'm just going to connect with people like me, my class, my race, my gender, whatever it might be. Those are the people who I associate with. And then that's the bonding.
That's the bonding.
And that can sort of lead to all sorts of bad stuff. But the bridging network is a network of interest, where you say, right, you live in this area, or you are connected to me in some way. It doesn't matter what your origin, your background, your color, your class, your gender is. I will connect with you, and I will form a strong bond of friendship with you. And I don't see any inherent conflict between having a love of place and a bridging network. I think you can do both. And especially, you know, in an era where people do move home quite a lot and stuff, I think we need to create welcoming, loving communities, where anyone, even if they're just living there for a few months, can feel that they're part of it, can feel that they've been welcomed, they've been engaged, they've been brought into that community. And it doesn't matter if their origin, their background is different to the other people there, that they will be as welcomed. And to do that, you need to create social institutions. You need to create thriving civic life, and that's built around the commons. So the allotments is a very good example, where the allotments is a classic bridging network, where you've got people literally with origins all over the world on those 200
Absolutely.
plots, and you make these amazing connections with people.
Yeah.
But you need to create the commons in order for that to happen.
Yeah.
So you need to create these community assets which aren't privately owned, which aren't fenced off, which don't say trespassers will be prosecuted or private keep out, but actually come in because this belongs to you as much as it belongs to me.
Yeah, that involve trees, water, you know, your land, your areas
Also
when you
things
were
like
as a child.
stuff like, you know, a community broadband or you know, community run shop. They don't have to be all natural assets. There can be all sorts of cooperatively run forms of wealth, where the wealth is shared not just in a sort of, we're handing out everyone a pile of £10 notes, but shared in a way where the actual wealth, rather than the capital, rather than the money, the actual wealth of that society is shared. So you all got a stake in the land, you've all got your feet in the ground, you've all got a say, a role in decision making, which is another crucial part of wealth, political wealth, you know, democracy. That is absolutely fundamental, and the commons greatly enhances that, because, you know, sorry, I keep coming back to this example just because I think it is a very good one. You know, the allotment association, the decisions are made by the members of the association.
It's a great example. It's such I just love the way in allotments you end up people sharing food, teaching them each other different pieces of themselves.
So our allotment neighbour is a Serbian woman she's probably 80 years old now, and she watched us like aghast as we were trying to scythe because it's an orchard and we got a meadow under the trees, and we tried to cut it with our scythe. She said, "You young ones, you know nothing. Yeah, give it to me." And she just she just sort of twitches her hips, and the grass just goes just like that. I mean, how do you do that? You know, she teaches us she's taught us to scythe the meadow. I mean, you know, and how else would I have formed that relationship? You have to have the commons. You have to have the things held in common and run in common and not owned but sort of possessed in common, where you have that sense of belonging. It belongs to you, you belong to it, but without that sense of individual ownership. But that is what brings people together, people from totally different backgrounds and cultures. And that's what makes society work.
Heart-centered community gathering, isn't it? And I feel that mixed age groups are really fundamental in that, when you're, you know, really allowing for all these ages, the elders and the children, to come together, and because they give each other so much, and we've got such separate living systems at the moment that you don't get children mixing with older people and things like that. Everything's so shut off.
It's so separate. Well, it's like, you know how I was saying about how in our we sort of morally pass our situation, so that we try to sort of split off, we separate off the elements of a moral system. So we say it's bad to have Caribbean investments because of the sugar, but it's all right to have English investments because and we try to split those things off, and we become morally impoverished in doing so. One of the characteristics of capitalism is that everything has been split off, is that we sort of, everything gets separated into its commodity. And so it's like, well, children belong here.
Yeah.
They belong in the nursery, they belong in school, they belong in the playground. They do not belong here because this has been designated for adult use. And it's all that sort of, everything gets removed from everything else. And that is a massive impoverishment of our social relations, particularly, as you say, the intergenerational thing. And, you know, there's so many lonely old people, and there are so many young parents who can't, with free time, and there's so many young parents who say, oh God, if someone could just get these kids off my hands for a few minutes, I can allow myself to think. And it's,
I'm one of those.
Yeah, I know, and it's like, surely there's a connection to be made here.
Yeah, exactly. And also interesting at this time with all the lockdowns, I was really aware of that, coming back into the nucleus and having that time when the children weren't at school, you were all together, and how enriching that was in many ways. I know not everyone found that.
I wouldn't say it was entirely enriching.
At least it was a chance to look at your nucleus.
Yeah,
even if it was uncomfortable, of which for sure for many it was.
I mean, the kids lost the community of school, you know, and school is great in that way.
But,
I mean,
often they've lost the community of family because the working parents.
Yeah, no, that's
and the
also
school
true.
becomes the community.
That's
so it's interesting to go back to that nucleus, which should be the family, and then it should be the ground on which the families are built.
Yeah, should it be the family? I'm not sure. I mean, obviously it has become the family, but. You know, you'll be aware of the old expression, it takes a village to raise a child. And it's certainly the case. I mean, I worked for several years with indigenous people on 3 continents. Yeah. And that idea that sort of this is the family.
Yes,
and it's in this box, and everything else is not family, and all those other adults are suspicious, and you know, that's just totally alien.
You know. It's totally and the kids, perforated, isn't it?
Yeah, kids like wander from one group to another, and there's that free flow of social interaction, which is so different from the way we've boxed ourselves off like characters in a Francis Bacon painting. And I do, you know, and the nuclear family is really quite a modern invention. There's a very interesting book by John R. Gittings called. Oh God, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, but what he looks at is how our social mores have changed over time, and it turns out that every single generation says things were better in the old days. You know, oh yes, people lived better in the old days. Oh yes, they were more ethical in the old days. It was better, and there's this conception of a traditional society which is totally mythic. It's totally invented. You know, so this idea that sort of, you know, no one ever shagged anyone else in the 1950s.
Oh, no.
No, never happened. And there's this complete myth making, which, you know, which the likes of Nigel Farage and people live off, you know, because they're constantly appealing to people who are looking back to a non-existent golden age, and I alone can restore this, and actually, you find that things were really fluid. Things were really fluid, and you go back, you know, even within English history, which you would think, you know, is pretty rigid by comparison to other people's histories, and it is, but things were so different. You know, I mean, very often it was not remotely clear whose child this was, and people would like move freely between households, and it was just completely different. I mean, there were even periods. Like in the 14th century, when gay people could marry.
Oh, you're saying the flow of people was much more.
It wasn't.
The families were less rigid.
Well, no. What I'm saying is we've got a rigid view of history.
Yeah.
We got this assumption that things were always. There's this sort of linear direction that history took, and that it was always a sort of development of the nuclear family or whatever, but it's not. It sort of goes off woof in that direction, and does crazy spirals in the middle, and it just, you know, and so there's lots of different models we could choose, even in a country like this, even when the weather forces us indoors most of the time. There's lots of different ways of living, and actually we don't experiment enough. We don't try out those ways of living. And it's very difficult because we're kind of forced by the need to work and the need to take the kids to school and all the rest into particular ways of living. But, you know, we can still break those bounds.
Great. So let's move on. We know how essential forests are to maintaining the global weather cycle. We know. If green technologies, electric cars, and mobile phones are using minerals and precious metals that are mainly to be found under ancient forests, how do you see the proposed green revolution impacting the global weather system?
Yeah, a very interesting question, and it absolutely touches on this crucial issue that, you know, we think, you know, we've been sold this idea that going green just means substituting everything we're already using, plus all the other stuff we're going to use because of economic growth, with stuff from other sources. And so like the way to green the transport network is to switch from your petrol or diesel car towards an electric car. But of course, that requires a massive use of resources. You know, and we're already seeing all the lithium mining and the coltan mining and the cobalt and all the other so many minerals, the rare earth metals, all the rest of it being dug up on an unbelievable scale. I mean, you see photos of these mines and you think, what am I looking at there? It just seems to be another planet. You know, and, oh my God, that's a gigantic hole, and they've destroyed this entire landscape.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it is, and often, of course, you know, the places where they get permission to mine, you know, it's not in central London, is it? It's in land which doesn't have a high monetary value, but it might have the highest wildlife value, the highest diversity value, habitat value. Now, the more we know about anything in nature, the more fascinating and amazing it is. I mean, that is a fundamental rule of science, that the more you discover, the more absolutely blows your pants off your bottom amazing those findings are. And the Nobre brothers in Brazil, Carlos and Antonio Nobre, and the researchers they work with, have been working on what appears to be this extraordinary property of the trees in the Brazilian Amazon, which is, you know, we all know that through evapotranspiration, trees create clouds, right? And that the forest maintains the hydrological cycle because of all the water evaporating from the leaves. But it's much more interesting than that. It seems that trees secrete special cloud-forming chemicals, which actually become the nuclei of those clouds, and that they are highly responsive to conditions and will produce particular chemicals in response to particular conditions to create the weather that they need. And so it's sort of, you know, it's sort of moving towards Gaia hypothesis. You know, the more we find, actually, the more the sort of Gaia hypothesis seems at the ecological level, at any rate, to stand up.
Seeders.
Yes,
Cloud
so they're
seeders.
cloud seeding.
Yeah.
And so the idea was, well, we could just do without the forests, you know, and just, you know, we need the lithium. We don't even know what we're destroying. We have no conception of the complexity that we're attacking here. And the age and the beauty and the wonder of the things we destroy for that much economic growth. You know, you think of the Aboriginal rock art in Australia, destroyed by Rio Tinto just to extract a little bit of mineral so that we can use it here. Just like overnight, one day, that's all it took to destroy thousands of years of, I mean, we call it culture, heritage. That doesn't in any way capture what was lost. You know, it's something which was sacred, beyond sacred, you know, something which was absolutely fundamental to the existence of the indigenous people of Australia. It was just destroyed in the blink of an eye, just to make a few dollars. You know, and it's that sort of contrast between the value of the things that we're destroying and the worthlessness of the things that we're making out of them. Because remember, you know, growth depends on capturing the disposable income of people with disposable income. So you have to sell them stuff, but by definition, they do not need. And hence all the sort of Secret Santa inflatable Zimmer frames and drum kit t-shirts and solar powered waving queens and selfie sticks for your dog. I mean, I'm not making any of this up. Portable watermelon coolers and pancake bots which will print a 3D picture on a pancake and all this stuff. I mean, this is real stuff I'm talking about. The iPotty, where the toddler can continue playing on their iPad while they're sitting on their potty because you can put it into the slot.
I've seen one.
Oh, you've seen one? Wow.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, all this stuff that is necessary for economic growth is total shit. This is complete junk, which is being produced out of these absolutely fundamental assets of the planet. These sacred places, these ancient places are being trashed to produce this total junk, because that is what the system depends on. It collapses without that. If that's what the system depends on, and that's what the system looks like, we have got the wrong system.
It's like a sort of addiction, isn't it? We're in some sort of addictive process, aren't we? Of this like consumer take, move. It's very yang. In my feeling, it's very greedy and taking, and it's really interesting to look at that within our own selves, isn't it? Like, which are the pieces, which are those sort of hungry yang pieces that we still have, because we've got to let go of that, haven't we? We've got to let go of the electric car. I always quite liked horse and cart.
Well, the horse and cart's got its own problems. Sorry. Hey, you like the chickens? Absolutely, like the chickens. Yes. Yes, so a friend of mine who's an organic grower, he calculated what if I were to swap my tractor for horses, and so he worked out that, the horses would take up a third of his land for a start, because he had to feed them, he had to grow the oats and all the rest that the horses are going to eat, and his food would be 3.5 times more expensive, because
The village could use the horse to pull the wood out of the forest without destroying it.
Yeah, no, that's true.
And they could also carry the kids
horse
off
logging
to
has
some class somewhere.
has got its virtues. Yeah, potentially. Horses are pretty hungry. I mean, as the expression.
What you're saying? We don't move around.
No.
I'm trying to respond to the green.
If you're talking about transport, local transport. I mean, a bicycle is much more eco than a horse.
Well,
doesn't need feeding.
Yes.
I do not. I've never fed my bicycle, but also it's easier to stable as well, and you don't get the RSPCA breathing down your neck if you've left it out in the rain for days on end.
Maybe there are just some.
Are we coming towards the end? Something tell me that way.
Maybe there are some just horse people and some bike people.
Maybe, but we couldn't. We couldn't all keep horses without a huge land take. It's too much like private luxury.
Yeah.
But anyway, but what I'm talking about is, first of all, reduce the need to travel. This is what Anne Hidalgo is doing in Paris, the mayor of Paris, with her 15-minute city. You create these sort of these nodes, these hubs, where you've got everything within walking distance. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
it's like that is. So you reduce the need to travel. You switch to other modes, walking and cycling, which are great for your health, as well as much less pollution, much less resource use and stuff. And then for people who can't do that, or longer distance, you got public transport, and then really, if you're talking particularly in urban areas, really cars are just for people with disabilities who cannot use those other modes. That is what they should be used for. So absolutely the blue badge scheme, totally. But no one else should be in their car.
Okay. A car share? No.
Well, I mean, not in the city. Why do
but
you
could
need it in the city?
then you could fit more trees and green and all that jazz, couldn't you? Because you're not having these priority places for cars.
I mean, so much space. So it's and Barcelona's about the least of it, and that's 25% of the city is devoted to cars. 25% of the land area of the city. Houston, 60%. I mean, we're giving so much. It's as if the car is our god. I mean, we don't sacrifice so much to anything. I mean, it's like sort of we bow down before you, oh automobile god, and we're going to give you half our city.
Yes, or even half the space around my house for the annihilation of all other beautiful things that could have been there.
Yeah, and the kids can't play in the street and all those other resources which you could use. Yeah. Anyway, I think I'm running out of steam, to be honest. So.
Okay, should we go for a couple more questions?
One more.
One more question. I'm going to make it a good one then.
Okay, all right.
Okay, just give me a moment. What are some things that means? What do you think, Georgie? The highlight. Where are the most powerful influence points to shift from destructive capitalism to circular economy and fair distribution? Says Jamie Throgmorton. Well done, Jamie. Nice question.
Yeah. Good question. Well, of course, the first thing, the way into this is to recognize the need for systemic change. You know, that there's not going to be one single way in, because actually you're looking at a new vision. You know, and this vision is being spelt out, you know, by people like Kate Raworth, by people like Janine Benyers, by people like Ingrid Robbins. Right? You know, there's a host of really, really interesting thinkers who are beginning to say it could be different. You know, there could be a whole different economics, but that is what we need. It is a whole different economics. It does get more difficult as you get closer to the details, though. You know, so many things where you say, "Oh, this is a circular economy." You look at it a bit closer and say, "That's not really very circular." You know, there's been waves of people now for the past 20 or 30 years who are saying we can dematerialize the way we live, and it's always to do with miniaturization. You know, sort of electronics get smaller and smaller and stuff, and actually, there's no automaticity there at all. You know, it's not automatic that the impact of the components in something smaller is lower than the impact of the components in something big. You know, you look at the coltan mining in Congo for our mobile phones, it's just horrendous. It's a massive, massive impacts. But also, it's not clear that miniaturizing things at the macroeconomic level actually reduces the use of materials, because you've got the Jevons paradox, or the Khazzoom-Brooks postulate, which kicks in, which is the efficiency paradox, which basically says that the more efficient you make the use of a resource, the more of that resource will be consumed. And the reason for that is that when a resource is used efficiently, it becomes capital efficient, and so it attracts capital, and so more money gets poured into the use of that resource. That's at the macro level, and then at the micro level, you've got the rebound effect, where it's just cheaper to use that resource, and so you'll use a bit more of it. Like, so, you know, electricity is more efficiently used, you'll use more electricity. But those two things coming together, the Jevons paradox and the rebound effect, can more than counteract your miniaturization of the use of a resource. So what that says to me is you can't actually come in at any one point. You have to have systemic change. You have to create a new economic system within which those subsets of the system begin to operate in ways which don't fall prey to those efficiency paradoxes. And in fact, there's efficiency paradoxes in everything. You know, Jevons talked about coal, but it's just as much the case with irrigation. You know, you say, right, we've got to move from flood irrigation to drip irrigation. So in the Guadiana Basin in Spain, the EU put 600 million euros into water efficiency, irrigation efficiency. To switch to drip irrigation led to an increase in water use, because it was more lucrative to irrigate your crops, as you weren't spending so much on water, so there's a far wider area of land got irrigated, and they ended up using more water. So you know, if you're trying to introduce elements of a circular economy into a capitalist economy, which is a linear, in fact, a logarithmic economy, it's not going to work. You have to change the system if any one element of that system is going to succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So huge thank you to George Monbiot. It's really great to go through this. And that was the last question we had time for tonight. And I think at this point, I just want to say thank you to Love It TV, to the Ecologist, to Resurgence. Special thanks to George. And we'll leave you now. This has been challenging, thought-provoking, and very, very interesting. I hope you've all really enjoyed it. There are there's more music and performance. There's a talk by Matt McCartney coming up, which is very, very beautiful. And let's just see who else we've got. Yeah, some music by Mobius Loop and Tallulah Rendall, and an animation from the Tree Sisters. So do stay on and enjoy, and from us, we will say good night.
Learn, children, learn, won't you please? You burn, children, burn your own knees. And yearn, children, yearn all you need. But learn, children, learn, won't you please? Walk, children, walk with your heads held high. Be sure that you're happy when your body dies. Entice, children, wise are your eyes. In time, children, right, children, right. Sweet children, sleep. Don't you cry for me. Believe, children, breathe. Teach your eyes to see that each of us bleeds and our hearts they beat. Children, seek, children, see you're the same species as me. Let's learn, children, learn, won't you please?
My name is Mac, and I'm speaking to you from my land here in Britain, in the southwest of England, near Dartmoor National Park, in a valley that we call Embercombe, sat by the lake. Now, it's 50 years since I was a teenager, about 17 years old. 50 years ago, I remember sat round our dining table as a family, having the first debates and discussions about our earth and what was happening on our earth and to our forests and our rivers and our cities. And all these questions were coming up and being hotly debated in our family around the dining table. Every year that's progressed since then, these conversations have continued. And we now have our environmental movement. We have a movement against the corporatization of our world. We have movements which are questioning the values upon which all business operates. And we have questions around people who are homeless, seeking countries to live and find a safe place to raise their families and children. We have, I think we could say without any equivocation, we could say we have a world which is in a highly charged, unstable, turbulent state. And this has been building perhaps for far longer than I've been alive, but it feels that it's coming now to a critical period in history, in global history, history that reaches right around the world, all peoples, all lands. And you have been born at a time when you will be in the full vigor of your youth and adulthood, during the period, I think, that these matters will come to a head. So I am, I suppose, on behalf of things far greater, far more, of far greater significance than me or my valley or my country or my place, I am extending an invitation. And that is saying that young people of our world are called to participate, to engage, and that this is the greatest calling that exists at this time and in this period of history. It is of huge significance and importance that you feel somehow that you hear this call, and that sufficient numbers of you answer that call by asking these questions of what it is that you most deeply and profoundly love, by asking the questions about what your gifts are, your particular piece that you can offer, by asking the question of what it is that you are responsible for, and then aligning the answers to those questions and offering them forward in action for what Charles Eisenstein calls this more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. That here at Embecombe we call the world of our longing. But the world of our longing, I think, is the same for all people of good heart around the world, of all nationalities. It is the answer to this question really is the one that will decide the fate of millions and millions and perhaps billions of creatures around this world, of forms of life, of trees, of oceans, of swamps, of rivers, of cities, of entire peoples, of our children and our grandchildren, and the children and grandchildren of all species. We say in this valley the greatest danger that we face at this time is not actually specifically climate change or the degradation of our environment or the corporatization of our world. It's the passivity of ordinary good people who choose to remain on the sidelines, observing, watching, sympathizing perhaps, but not engaging. There's somebody who has come and is continuously in some way falling in love with the world and her people and all beings progressively more every year, something that I delight in and have some sense of pride in. I am, on behalf of all peoples of the world, on behalf of the bird that I can hear singing in the background here, on the behalf of these grapevine leaves that you might be able to see in this screen, on behalf of the lake that is behind me, the dragonflies, the fish, saying, please step forward, accept the invitation. Come and join hands with many thousands of others and sing powerfully this song of life. Sing powerfully this song of creation. Sing powerfully this song that we are family and that we are needed and that we have arrived here together at this time. That is my invitation.
Here's the story of how the world transformed from this to this. Back in 2020, life began to break down. The climate was changing faster than anyone had predicted. Australia and the Amazon burned. Deforestation, crazy weather, extinctions, and the increasing risk of disease pushed our planet to the limit. People believed that all the power lay in the hands of those who cared more about profit than life. I was there. A few of the humans tried to turn things around, but there just weren't enough of them taking care of the earth. Nature grew sicker and sicker. The forests were damaged so much by humans that some animals couldn't survive. Other creatures found a way to live among the humans. Viruses were able to pass from species to species and then to human beings. One day, life ground to a halt. For millions of people, normal life stopped, but without the eyes of those many to see, the plunder of the planet sped up. More forests were destroyed and more damage was done. The people had plenty of time to think and big questions were asked. They realized that their health and the health of the planet were the same thing, that without the forests, they couldn't breathe. So they took their power back and began to plant trees and restore the forests. The women got together and led the way. Slowly, people began to give back to the planet. They knew they could not fix the problem with the same mindset that created it. So the people called for the voices of those who understood the earth and her systems. They ensured that the way that they restored the forests helped the people, the animals, the rain, and the rivers, so that all life could flourish and health could return. Those people were your great-grandmothers and grandfathers. In the face of so much fear and destruction, they found the courage to act, and they restored our world. What's needed right now is action. A sustainable, healthy future begins with healthy forests. Some people have voices and time. Others have the power to make a significant contribution by funding trees. If that's you, please step up. Your monthly donation to Tree Sisters will support ethical, community-focused tree planting across multiple tropical ecosystems. Will you join us and restore the health of our world?
As the oceans rise, tears in our children's eyes, we know we're part bliss. We've danced our dance with those devil minds. Let's stand as one, use our voice, and start saving lives by holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. The stakes are high, they've been before. Our world's on its knees, bleeding out from every pore. The call to save the land, the trees, the rivers, the oceans, and as many species. by holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change. And be the change, be the change. And be the change, be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the change, let's be the change. By holding on to love, uniting one another, holding on to love, uniting sisters and brothers, holding on to love. Let's be the chain, let's be the change.